All right, everybody. I think we are live. I'll go ahead and wait a moment for people to get into the room. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we'd love to know who you are. So introduce yourself in the chat. And while we just hang out for a second and wait for a couple more to join. As you can see on this platform, the chat should be working. So again, introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's in the room. And you can also click on handouts to receive the handout and the activity we're going to be working on today with you. All right, so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide after we introduce ourselves. Welcome again to our session. Thanks for coming. We are part of the IDRA team. I am the STEM and Gender Equity Education Associate at IDRA, and I'm also the director of the Texas Chief Science Officers Program and a program called Vision Coders, an EIR grant-funded program. My pronoun is she, her. Hector, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Hector Bojorquez. I'm Director of Operations at IDRA. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Stephanie Garcia, who's directing so many of our STEM programs, and she's an absolute joy to work with. And we hope to be able to give you some information about broadening participation in STEM.
Absolutely. I'm going to drop in the chat a companion resource. I'll just continue pasting it in the chat so that people can see it. It's just got the resources shared and compiled for you. As I make a lot of different references to different things, don't feel rushed to have to write it down. And again, we would love for you to jot down your role, title, pronouns, and location in the chat. I just want to make sure it works. So I'm going to make sure it's enabled for everybody. If it's not, let me know in the Q&A tab. Oh, good. It is working. Great. I know Hector was able to put it in.
At least for us. So
at least for us. I would love for somebody to try it out. Again, just introduce yourself. That would be great so we know who's in the room. And again, out of all the sessions you can choose from, we are so grateful that you chose ours. We would love to, again, just use this time to explore some asset-based STEM leadership practices and recommendations to make necessary shifts in our own communities and spaces to truly broaden participation in STEM. Oh, no, the chat is not working. That's why it's so quiet. Let's see. How do I enable? I'm trying to work on it. I think we have a facilitator in the room. Can you please enable it? How do I get this working? Because we have a lot of activities using the chat room today.
While that's going on, Stephanie, we can have them just start in the Q&A, and I can publish as it goes along.
Okay. Yeah, we'll pivot. So if the chat feature, again, is not working, just go ahead and put it in the private Q&A tab, and we can publish them so that everybody can see who's in the room too. So sorry about that. We do have somebody in the room, I think, working on it as well. But again, just use that Q&A tab, and we can publish it for everybody to see. So moving on, we have... again, a time where we can answer a lot of your questions. So in the moment, if you've got a burning question, put it on the parking lot, as they say, use that Q&A tab, and we can see them as presenters. So any kind of burning question that you have, you can put it in the chat or the Q&A tab. So just a little bit of a housekeeping if you're new to Big Chalk, and maybe this might be your first session as part of the IDRA EAC-South convening. So again, welcome. Just click on that Q&A tab and you should be able to add your questions there.
Yeah, and we have Ray Johnson, greetings from San Antonio, Katrina Martinez, RGCGISD, special education, and I'll go ahead and keep on publishing these and talking to you.
Thank you. Welcome. Welcome, Christina. We have a lot of friends in the room. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So excited that you're here. All right, so as we are jumping into our session around broadening participation in STEM, it's super important to create this common terminology in this space. So I'm going to allow Hector, we can switch roles. I'll go and present everything or publish everything in the Q&A. If you want to go ahead and define what broadening participation even means, that's a good way to start.
Yes, broadening participation is meaningful in 3 different ways. Let me go ahead and make that larger for us, because if it's small for me, it's probably small for you. There you go. Can you make it a little bit larger?
No, I can't, but as participants, they can click full in the top right corner, and it'll make it full screen.
So they can see. All right. So broadening participation has, and for our purposes and for purposes, both say, for example, National Science Foundation, we're looking at ways of broadening participation both at the individual level, to the institution, to a geographic area. And what that basically means at the individual level, of course, is when we're looking at the individuals are those areas of individuals, those folks who are underrepresented in STEM. And those groups that are underrepresented in STEM have been students of color and women, who are the 2 target areas, African-American, Latinx students, and women, and the intersectionality thereof. That have been very underrepresented. When we look at how institutions are able, how we can broaden participation, and how NSF kind of looks at broadening participation, it's also at the institution level, as far as what the makeup is of the folks there, but also what sort of the practices that they are able to recommend and to research and study that increase participation, both at the individual level as well. So we're also including in there students with people with disabilities. So there are the goals and practices there at the institutional level. I'd like to make sure that we kind of have a distinction. We'll have the distinction of the institutions themselves, such as a school. We'll have teachers in STEM that are diverse, represent diverse, underrepresented, but also that the practices that they are also trying to research and trying to implement increase the STEM participation for those students. So that's, it's kind of splitting the hair, but I want to make sure that you understood those pieces. The other part is basically around geographical areas. Which geographical areas are underrepresented that have to do with those same people of color, et cetera. But also, we can also talk about larger areas such as Alaska. Alaska is considered underrepresented, an underrepresented region. There's regions throughout the South that are vastly underrepresented. So all of those, that is what we mean by broadening participation. And what NSF is really looking at broadening participation, the National Science Foundation. So there's all of those things there. Do you have a question? Any questions right now that I'd like to make sure that we're all on the same in the.
I don't see any questions.
No questions. Okay. So when anybody is seeking funding for NSF, for National Science Foundation, they're looking at those kind of the groups that are there: Alaska Natives, Native Americans, African Americans, Blacks, Hispanics, Latinx, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and our persons with disabilities. Now, obviously, as we're all students, and as we talked about being equity warriors, we know that there is intersectionality among these. And also what's not mentioned in there is LGBTQ, often because that's not a population that people think about when they're thinking about underrepresentation in STEM. But it's something that I would like to point out we should keep in mind as we're looking at underrepresentation, because if you have that kind of intersection between, say, a population like a Latinx population or an African American population, or even people with disabilities who are also LGBTQ, who have had lots of basically systemic discrimination, and you add gender issues, the chances of them being included in STEM also decrease. So we really are looking at broadening participation for all these categories. And I hope that answers it.
Absolutely. No, it's super crucial to be able to first establish common terminology in this space. And we just used, for example, this kind of grant kind of context of NSF, because you'll see this often as you're pursuing different STEM grants in education or community context. So thanks so much, Hector. We're going to now switch roles. Hector will monitor the chat, but it is working now, apparently. So again, make sure you're using the chat tab to share out to the whole group, or you can use the Q&A tab for a private question to just the presenters to view. And then lastly, I've added a sticky note that has an embedded link to a shared Google Doc with all the resources, so you don't have to worry about trying to keep up with your note taking. Welcome. We have a really great group. So let's kick off with a poll question. So I would love to see for you, now that the chat's working, to jot down in the chat one challenge that you have personally faced or noticed and observed around participating, broadening participation in STEM. So now that we've defined what it means, what challenges are you currently facing or currently you're observing in regards to broadening participation in STEM? I would love to see your comments in the chat, and feel free to just think about it for a moment, and you can post it later when it comes to mind. But we would love to just poll the room and kind of see what challenges you're currently facing, and then we'll kind of address those throughout today's presentation. So please click on chat at the top right, and then you'll be able to jot your challenges there in the chat room.
Sorry about that. I got kicked out.
Oh, no worries. No worries. I'm going to go.
I was like, what happened? Yeah.
No worries. I'm going to go ahead and go through a few asset-based STEM practices and recommendations that Hector and I put together for you. Again, all the references that I'll make are in the resources page linked above the chat. And again, keep responding. What challenges are you facing? I see waiting lists as one. Continue to jot down those challenges, and hopefully we can offer some solutions, or at least generate some more ideas of how to approach these challenges. So, one recommendation that we want to make is sustainable transformation. Right away, when I personally think about sustainable transformation in general, I'm a science nerd, environmental science and science teacher. So I think of the butterfly transforming, right? And so I also think of Paulo Freire. I think of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I put in the Google Doc one of my favorite quotes from the book, where he says, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. And I think as we are seeking transformation, as we're reopening, reconnecting, reimagining, reclaiming this next school year, it takes being uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, and willing to confront, willing to listen, and willing to see things differently, right? But also pairing that with sustainability. So sustainable transformation is crucial, and we can't assume that a one-time exposure will mean inspiration and long-lasting change, right? We need a sustained approach. And as a former club sponsor, don't get offended, but we know clubs aren't a substitute, right, for systemic change. We know that there's depth to that work, and that work can't be based on one single individual or one single professor or teacher on campus. And looking at grants and looking at from that context. We want sustainability once that grant cycle ends, once the funding ends. We want that sustainable transformation, and that's something we should definitely seek. And as a call to action, we really want that targeted kind of professional development and staff development, but also we need to advocate for equitable policies that can help lead to that transformative change and institutional accountability. as we kind of seek this in our STEM kind of spaces in our community and schools. Hector, you want to add to anything before I progress to the next point?
Yes, the reason this is extremely important that you really take a serious look at this is that we cannot have sort of what we would call in the past kind of a drive-by interventions where they're very quick, and we hope that inspires students to become computer scientists, for example. That's just not how it works. We don't expect for reading, numeracy, literacy to develop in a way that kids are able to read or do general math by just showing them like one math problem and hope that excites them. No, it's something that's systemic across time, and unfortunately, that's how a lot of the way we treat some science to the point that we often don't look at science as something that is done, but as something that is integrated into reading, for example, because of the way our testing regime is. How often do we see that a science class is really just an extension of reading in some grade levels, and that just can't continue, or we're going to have a huge equity gap between students of color and underrepresented students that are just not going to be in, say, for example, in computing. It's just not going to happen. That gap is already huge and is going to continue to get larger if we don't do something about it now.
Absolutely. Going to our next recommendation, we really wanted to make sure we reiterate what I know Dr. Garcia already kind of talked about in his keynote in the opening session. If you missed it, you got to go listen to that later. But really challenging the discourse in our spaces. So whether it's a Great Point Elise, whether it's a STEAM or STEM space, we definitely want to challenge any kind of ideas that are exchanged in these spaces that really kind of reiterate and perpetuate biases. And, we want to make sure that we push back on any, for example, tokenistic approaches or notions in our space, because again, it reminds me of if you were a part of a convening that happened in San Antonio last year, a STEM convening. I know many STEM ecosystem members are in this space, but in that room, we had a keynote speaker who said that, he was always the Black kid on the front of the brochure, right? So that tokenistic approach where they're in this space, you could hear pins drop in the whole arena because, again, it's pushing back on these kind of notions that are very simplistic and surface level, and we strongly want to recommend pushing back on those kind of fluff notions too that Dr. Gorski mentioned this morning. And one of my favorite quotes from Eubanks, Parrish, and Smith, they say, so we argue very strongly that any real effort to make substantive systemic change must begin with a discourse dialogue in schools, one that blames no one and deconstructs what is really going on. So this productive discourse where we're deconstructing what's happening, deconstructing these institutional systemic barriers that are in place to bring on and focus on that institutional change that we're seeking. As Dr. Gorski said, we want to truly transform the conditions that are marginalizing for many students and communities, really paying attention to the diversity within diversity, and really acknowledging that awareness does not necessarily change mindsets and practices and systems, right? So I love that he brought these up, and sometimes that takes kind of calling out these oppressive behaviors or language and discourse that's happening in the spaces. Hector, you wanted to add something?
Yes, there's some very specific practices that do this. There is a school district that I know of that has a STEM academy that is, when we hear of a STEM academy, we usually hear of people having to apply to it and that have a waiting list, that have these sort of issues. So that in itself is gatekeeping to all of our kids, to a lot of kids. This does not have to be the case. That status quo does not have to be there. There are districts in the state of Texas, I can think of one, that their STEM academies do not have that. Anybody who wants to come in, who wants to be in there, is going to be there. And when I've questioned them and asked them as to, well, what happens when they can't, when they're having problems, and they looked at me like, what do you mean? What happens? We're here to support them to be able to rise to that level. So that in itself challenges the notion of the way everybody thinks about some of these academies. Some of these academies, there's just a laundry list of things that you have to do in order to come in STEM. This particular district said, no, that's not what we're going to do. And by that, they disrupted completely the way other people should think about things.
That's a great example. Thank you for that. I think it adds a lot of perspective, especially to the comment Ray made in the chat. But that was one specific challenge that he identified. Another recommendation for us is really allow students' curiosity to be the authentic driver. If you're a part of maybe any kind of computer science, or you've heard of pair programming, where one person's the driver and the other person is like the navigator, just trying to help and guide. And I think that takes a lot of flipping of traditional classroom teaching and approaches, where the role of the teacher changes, it shifts, where they are the facilitator. They're not necessarily the expert in the room, and the student is the one who is driving the experience, the learning experience in the class. And we want to definitely emphasize achieving high expectation through, we've got to have authentic supports that really help scaffold students through this, through their curiosity, through their capacities, to build really authentic spaces where their curiosity really is the driver in the classroom. And there's a lot of really great resources I shared on our Google Doc that's referenced in the chat room on the blue Post-it. A couple texts that help just give practical ways for classrooms, for teachers, of how to do this, where we can truly reposition the learning experience. And we have to mention project-based learning, just being a stellar approach that helps position students as the authentic driver, real project-based learning. And I've linked in there, what is project-based learning? If you want to explore that a little bit more, we really lean in on Bucks Institute, PBL works of really positioning students in that way, where they are the driver in the classroom. And it reminds me of a student that was a part of a student panel here in San Antonio. And he said, if you want to get more students involved in STEM, you need to create a world of wonder. And so he was really pushing for and advocating actually for project-based learning approaches in all schools, because he as a student saw that as a valuable experience for him. And he really truly recommended other educators and stakeholders in the room to listen in on that. I've also linked in the resource document some services, because IDRA can help you and coach you and mentor you along this. And Hector, did you want to add anything about this?
No.
Yes, we see in the chat room, it is a great experience as for educators and students both, actually. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Moving on to another recommendation we wanted to make as we're seeking to truly broaden participation in STEM and lean into asset-based practices in STEM. I don't like to start recommendations with don't, but I just have to in this situation. We want to make sure that we don't shut down our students. Their forms and ways of knowing. We don't want to do that. So that's one thing we want to avoid. Our students come to us, going back to Paulo Freire, right? They're not empty vessels where we just make deposits into them. They're coming with a wealth of experiences, a wealth of knowledge and resources to add to the STEM learning experience. And so we need to find ways to connect the content to their homes, to their communities, to their languages, and that's culturally, if you look into culturally sustaining pedagogy, and I know Dr. Gorski laid out a whole list of some asset-based kind of approaches and pedagogies. And so, there's many ways to do this, even though many view science and math as very like drill and kill kind of prescriptive kind of classrooms and curricula. We beg to differ. There's many ways to integrate even ethnic studies into science and math. And even if it's not a school-wide approach, there's ways to flip things and change things in your classroom, in your class period even. And I've also listed in the resource guide in the top of the chat, a really great guide to anti-bias and anti-racist work in your school community. And within that book, there's a whole section on what that looks like in STEM. So truly recommend that, because again, I'm always looking for the practical kind of takeaways for teachers and changes you can make. But again, as we go back to the theme of this whole convening, as we're reopening, reconnecting, and reclaiming education this next school year, I have to stress the value of authentic relationships, building authentic relationships with your students and with your families. This is a crucial asset-based practice. As I was looking at some data, I think less than half of 6th through 12th graders ever get to experience strong relationships with the adults in their school community. So this is something we definitely want to shift and change as we're heading into reopening our schools this next school year. You want to add anything, Hector?
Yes, the whole bit about don't shut down exploration and other forms of knowledge. There are times when students come up with things that may shock our sensibilities. So I can think of a group of students that I encountered that basically were behind a raw sewage system. Basically, their whole colonia was behind a raw sewage system, and they had seen an ad on the internet for something called a fartometer, and so they brought this up to folks, and some folks were like, why, that's just vulgar to say that. But they realized what was really at the root of this is that these students wanted to collect information about how much foul air was in their system. And where they lived, and that is something that, just because it might have sounded a little bit uncouth to some, there was some very deep environmental racism ideas that they wanted to go and look at and explore. So that's part of what we mean by don't shut down explorations. The forms of knowledge that they come with are varied, and sometimes we can't afford to let it pass us by just because we're older now and don't get the jokes.
Yeah, that's a great example. Absolutely. And looking at one of our last recommendations for the time being before we transition into an activity is truly leverage your network and your partners to expand opportunities. We're in a really great space of now over 500 people that you can connect with. So I put that as a little simple reminder in our resource page for this session that find people that can be an accomplice, right? More than an ally, more than an advocate, but somebody to come alongside of you and truly disrupt some things that are spaces that need to be disrupted, push back on the fluff, and really help promote this broadening participation in STEM. So we here at IDRA, we're full of these equity gadflies, as we call ourselves. So we're willing to come alongside you and support you in this work. But also I put in the chat in the Google Doc, the shared Google Doc for this session, 2 resources specifically as it pertains to STEM. I'm also the lead of the Alamo STEM ecosystem, which is a cross-sector partnership where we have equity as the forefront of our lens in this work and our STEM work here in our city, as well as I've linked the international STEM ecosystems. And these are communities, so I know we have people from all over beyond just Texas. So I want to make sure that you have people, a network that you can connect with. If you didn't already know, there's a lot of people doing this work, especially as it pertains to STEM. So I wanted to make sure that you had your links there in the Google Doc. Anything you want to add to this, Hector?
No, I want to make sure that we have time for the rest of it. So we're good at that. That was a good explanation.
Great. We're going to transition then into our activity. And I wanted to make sure also right above where it says chats, if you go to the right, a little bit more to the top right of your screen, there's a tab that says handouts. You can go ahead and look at the handout for our next activity. It's also on our resource page if you need a quick link. But we're going to transition into a little bit of what I like to call like a critical friends activity. So, and I kind of got this from back in my doctoral program, we would kind of share our work and share critical insights, constructive feedback on some new ideas or projects or research or work. And so we wanted to present to you almost like a case study. We want to frame it as a case study, as a pilot study, and we would love to get your input because we want to kind of share ideas and position ourselves in that way as we're exploring this topic more. And so to provide a little bit of context, we have our IDRA's Texas Chief Science Officers program. It's an out-of-school time STEM program for 6th through 12th graders. And, we truly want to broaden participation in this program, right? We want to make sure that students who aren't necessarily in STEM academies or STEM schools of innovation, we want to make sure that students who don't have access to in-school or out-of-school time STEM programs and activities have access to be in this kind of STEM leadership program. And so I have in the Google Doc a link to this program if you want to learn a little bit more to have more insight. But, some questions that we're wondering as the director of this program is, how can we broaden participation in this program? How can we broaden our impact? How can we better meet the needs of our youth and our community? Since it is student-driven and student-led, we want to make sure we're positioning students well and we're giving them a platform in our community. And then also, how can we disrupt the structural barriers in STEM programming? So this is a little bit of context, but again, I'm going to let Hector kind of lead you through this proposed rubric or criteria. I'm going to have you click on the handout, or you can scan this QR code with your phone. You can also access, again, this rubric through the post-it in our chat. And we're just going to break this apart a little bit more. I'll pass it on to Hector to lead us through.
Surely. I'll go back real quick to give some background into what for example, the CSO program is. So kind of what you're critiquing and giving us feedback on, and also they give us kind of feedback whether what you can apply from one of the things we just talked about. So we have a situation where there is a program called Chief Science Officers, where in Chief Science Officers, it's a program that any district can take on, and we implement it in several districts in San Antonio and other areas of Texas. And basically what happens is students are voted to become, they're chosen by their peers or by their teachers to become chief science officers, basically science ambassadors. And it's 2 students, a female student and a male student. And these students then basically bring science STEM activities to foster more STEM in their schools. Now, we have been kind of in talks as to how we can broaden participation, because as it is, we feel that the program needs to think bigger, think a little bit bigger, because when you have this situation of just 2 particular students, we could run into some equity issues. So one of our ideas as to how we can broaden this issue really comes down to how the students are asked to participate and how many students are asked to participate, because in many, not only in this program, but in many of the STEM programs that we see time and time again, what we're seeing is students are basically asked to self-select into a STEM program because they're interested in either robotics, a after-school club, an after-school STEM club, a coding club, even Code Jam. Those are all students that have already kind of self-selected themselves to be, because they're interested in that. And we see the issue of just setting up a program that is just self-selected, or that others select you because they see that you're a leader in that, as having possible equity issues. So what we came up with, if you were not able to, let's see.
Yeah, keep going. One more.
There you go. So instead, what we thought of is creating a situation where we kind of create a criteria for students coming into the program. And rather than in this situation, instead of having 2 students, having about 15 students, and having those 15 students fit into 3 different categories. So say, for example, in this category where we have 55% of students should fit this criteria. And what we're saying in this one is that, let's say, under STEM identity, we give all students a STEM interest survey. And the students that we ask to participate are students who may not have that much interest, much of a STEM identity. They just don't have, they have a low to medium score in one of those surveys. they don't seem to have an interest. And we take that as one of the domains that we look at when we're trying to choose participants, students, to come into a program. It doesn't have to be CSO, it could be any particular program. Another one of the domains here to look at for this that would make up 55% of the participants would be under academic, that their student achievement may be average to slightly below average. And that is because too often what we're looking at with students who we ask to be in STEM programs are students who already are, quote unquote, high flyers. They self-select and they're maybe quote unquote high flyers. And here in the school and under domain of socio-emotional learning, school connectedness, we basically say that we should survey them using a Panorama student tool or the PERTS tool that look at school connectedness, and that those students that we ask for that to be in the program could have a low school connectedness score. So what you're seeing here is that over half of the participants that we would ask do not meet the criteria that are normally fit because students are asked to self-select. When you usually have students that are self-selecting, they tend to be a bit more high on all these scores. They trying to be already interested in STEM. They trying to be interested in school, and they have more. They already have good scores, and they may have school connectedness is fairly high. So we're saying that whatever program you decide you're going to create, that you ask over half of your students to be this kind of student. Again, we are also, and what a column here is also that fit into your demographics, your racial, ethnic demographics, and gender demographics. That's a column that we were assuming in here. So we want to make sure, though, that it's not just the kids who are already interested in this. So now when we look at what 25%, now that was 55%, now we look at 25%. Now we think that 25% of those students should fit this criteria, should fit this other criteria, which that they're basically average on all of those, that they have an average STEM interest. It's just an average STEM interest. Their student achievement could be average, and their school connectedness could be medium. So those would all be just medium. So you have students who are, as we say, students that are just, and not that they're average students, they're just your mainstream population. And then we would say that 20%, we're recommending that 20% are the students who may have a very high STEM identity. They have medium to high academic achievement. And here in school connectedness, we put low to high. Those students, we have found through our own experience that students who self-select in STEM and who have high academics, their school connectedness could be anywhere from low to high. They don't have any. They're not always a high in school connectedness. They could have difficulties in being connected to school. So this comes up, this adds up to 100. And what we're suggesting here, though, is that whatever program you come up with, whatever you're trying to do, that your students fit this kind of criteria, that your population, the target, all the students that are coming in fit this kind of criteria. Because otherwise you're going to end up only with this 20% kind of student. And that is not going to broaden our participation at all. That's just going to kind of narrow participation, if anything. We continue asking the same students to be involved in this, and we need to be able to invite the others. So what the change that does that you have to then take into consideration is, what do you have to do as a provider of these services in order to make sure that the 45 and 25, the 55% and the 25% over here succeed? What supports do you have to provide so they succeed? Because obviously what's been going on in our schools, we don't look at those other, we only look at the 20% for our STEM. We don't look at these other guys over here. We just don't. So we have to take our interventions, our ideas, our academies, all of the things that we're trying to implement, and provide the supports for these kids over here. And the only way to do that is to assume that they can take up the leadership roles in all of this, and that once that you assume that, they will rise to the challenge. And I can say this with full comfort and full confidence, because for 30 years we've been doing something similar with the Valued Youth Program. We've had kids who are in who are in at-risk situations, and we make them leaders by having them do cross-age tutoring, where they are basically tutoring the small younger kids in kinder and first. And what happens then is over these 30 years that we've had the program, they rise to the challenge. Their academics improve, their discipline improves, and their student attendance increases. All of those indicators increase because we suddenly believe in them. And if you create your programs to make sure that you're addressing these guys over here, 55% and 25%, those students will rise to the challenge, because you're telling them that you believe in what they're doing. You believe that they can do it. And your support will help them rise to that. And if we can't do this, we're going to continue to have the same results. In Texas right now, I can tell that one of the problems we're seeing is everybody knows what endorsements are. In Texas, well, I'm saying everybody knows. Some of you all may not know. Endorsements are basically where students choose their course of study in 8th grade. By choosing their course of study in 8th grade, what ends up happening, they choose, like, if they're going to go into STEM or if they're going to go into vocational or technical. And what we've seen is that the STEM endorsement, the students who decide to go in STEM, is in the highest it gets across everywhere is 11% of kids going into STEM. And how many graduate to that is even less.
Smaller, yeah.
It's small. But okay, I got to come back because I get really excited about
No.
I want to make sure that you leave with that idea of that. Do you have? Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, no, just so in the kind of wrapping up with the 8 minutes left, and we're going to try to stop for any Q&A at the end. We really want to make sure, as Hector said, all right, we have them all at the table, but now what, right? So really creating leadership roles for our students that are at the table, right? Having them drive, again, the curiosity within our programming, within our curriculum experiences, teaching experiences, having students identify the challenges, create projects where they identify the problem that needs to be addressed, right? And then so wrapping up, we would love to know what asset-based, as you're kind of reflecting on some of the points and recommendations made in today's session, we'd love to know your final kind of reflections in the chat. Again, feel free to address what I dropped in the chat was just kind of, what do you wonder about the rubric that we kind of proposed? What do you recommend even? But also you can answer this question as a reflection question. What asset-based or, takeaways basically have you identified to make the necessary shifts in your own STEM spaces and communities that you're at? We would love to know your recommendations kind of your next steps when you leave this session. What are some things that you want to try? What are some things that you're going to do going into this next school year as we reopen and reconnect and reimagine? And then lastly, some final kind of recommendations as you're jotting your reflections in the chat. I put in the resource document for this session, some links to an article around critical race curriculum and my dissertation as well about, how I studied what that looks like. What does it look like? What are we looking for in a kind of science classroom or in STEM spaces? What does that look like? So I have some further recommendations that are really interdisciplinary. So it doesn't matter what subject these practices and approaches could apply. Lastly, I've got about 1 more minute here before we have 5 minutes for Q&A. There's really a need for a sense of community that requires trust to establish a classroom culture and climate that's grounded in equity, where the teacher, again, as we talked about earlier, is learning from and with their students, So establishing trust is super important as we're doing this work. Keep in mind to continue to have an approach of care, love and care, right? This pedagogy of care is necessary when you think about the whole child, right? The whole child that's coming into your space. And then respecting the, respect for historically marginalized students, families, and communities, and their experiences and their needs. And lastly, pride, for maintaining the heritage and community practices of our students and families. So I know we have some really great sessions around culturally sustaining pedagogy, and all of that's super important for our work and applies. And then lastly, just encouraging your voice matters. So any opportunity you get to, again, as we're seeking sustainable transformation, especially in STEM, make sure that you're voting on equitable STEM policies and practices that affect your school, your community. And then lastly, feel free to contact us. We have our, on the resource page, we have our emails. I've even embedded, my Twitter and LinkedIn, because I would love to connect with you and be your accomplice in this work as we can bounce some ideas off of each other. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We appreciate you. All right, so we're going to, again, leave the last 4 minutes. Hector, if you have any final thoughts, but anybody can put in some questions that you have in the chat or final thoughts. We are finished with our presentation.
The only thing I would say is call us.
Yeah,
call
absolutely.
us. Our emails are here. Our emails are all over the place.
Yeah.
So make sure to call us if you want to implement something, if you have some ideas on how, or you'd like to discuss with us how you'd like to adapt some of the things that you're doing, or help us adapt some things that we're doing in order to advance this. We're seeing just the data doesn't look good. Well, the data doesn't look good for STEM in our kids and underrepresented students. It just does not look good. And I told someone recently that we really needed to start, and I am completely dead serious, that we need to start doing a project where we are able to start teaching our underrepresented kids quantum mechanics at an early age in junior high. And somebody said, well, we got to get them to learn algebra first. And I said, no, we're already behind in regular computing. When quantum computing, which is the next step in computing, comes, which is already right around the corner, our students are just not going to be there. They will not be there. We're already not represented in regular computing. They will not be represented at all when it comes to the quantum computing, which is less than a decade, if not. It's here. So that really should terrify us. We have our work cut out for us.
Yeah, we do. I love what's happening in the chat. STEM is possible for all students if we believe in them. Absolutely. Absolutely. We need to create really great opportunities for them, and we can help each other in this work. So again, leverage this partnership, leverage this network. We get siloed in this work, right? Very often, and that doesn't have to be the case. So again, we can always, I know often I have little Zoom coffee chats with friends doing this work in this space. So I'm just offering that out there for anybody that wants support in this work. Thank you, Christina. We appreciate your comment.
And we're at 2:20. Thank you.
All right. Enjoy the rest of the convening, everyone.
And make sure you come back tomorrow, the rest of the convening, and if I don't see you again, make sure you come back tomorrow.
See you in the closing session too. Yeah, today's a wonderful closing session. You don't want to miss it. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for the reminder. Make sure you check out the agenda.
And answer your evaluations.
Thank you, Isabel. We appreciate you. Yes, the evaluations are extremely important for us. So please do so. Bye, Katrina. Thank you for joining. Hi, Josephine. Thank you, amiga, for being in this space with us. We appreciate you. Thanks, Ray. Thank you, Loie. Appreciate you. See you all later in the closing session.